And really, we're exploring how to call in and practice an ethic of collective care, collaboration, and equity as we engage in our work in transforming current food systems. My name is Shafali. I work for Food Systems Leadership Network, which is a project of Wallace Center. We call ourselves a national peer learning community, which above all means that we are a space where we can bring people together to learn, where we can approach our discussions as both teachers and learners all at the same time, and allow the process of doing that to strengthen the individual and collective leadership capacities in all of our communities. And one of the ways that we try to activate these spaces is by collaborating with other network members, like Elias, who's here today as a facilitator. Elias is a recipient of an FSLN activation grant. The intention of this grant program is to support the creativity and amplify the voices of our network members and share their work with you all, our broader network. And today, Elias has brought with him Nicole, who we're really honored and excited to host in this space. Nicole is going to speak on how to activate relational principles in our food systems transformation work today. And that is something that we try to also practice and activate in our own spaces here at the Food System Leadership Network when we're gathering with you all. And the way we do that is we've co-created a few cultural practices that with our network members that we try to engage with every time we are gathering together. And I would like to share some of these practices with you just to create the space where we can all feel as safe and as cared for and as free as possible. And so I think we should take a minute. We can take a look at some of these practices. And if there's anything specific that's really resonating with you right now or that you'd like to hold as we convene together to listen to Elias and Nicole, please put that in the chat. Yeah, I know I'm holding right now the giving grace to one another as we approach conflict with curiosity. That I feel like something that I come back to over and over again. Right. So these are here for you whenever you might need them, and we will share them with you along with this recording. And with that, I'd love to move it to Elias, and he can introduce Nicole. Thank you so much.
Cool. Hey, everyone. We got a good group here today. Definitely some more folks than we had in webinar one, which again is also recorded. So we can share that with you all if you want to go back and catch up after this one. Quick introduction for myself. I like to think of myself as a weaver, bringing people together, connecting dots, connecting ideas to sort of create a whole that is greater than its individual parts. I'm a development manager at Fresh Approach. We're a nonprofit in the Bay Area working to connect farmers and communities through nourishing food. And I moved out here after I got a master's in the environment and sustainable food systems in Colorado, which is where I met Nicole. And I studied under Nicole, and I still keep in touch with Nicole, who's one of my mentors today. Mentors and friends. Mentor can be a weird word sometimes. So I like to write. I like to meditate, which is something we did in the first webinar. I like to run. I like to DJ, among many other things. So today, before I hand it over to Nicole, I wanted to share a few slides about what this webinar series, which is 3 parts, is sort of rooted on. A concept I learned about in grad school under Nicole was the idea of leverage points in systems change. So in here, a lot of us are advocates and activists, And we're always wondering about how we can change or transform the systems that we exist within and are dissatisfied with, especially in times like these. And so we went sort of a foundational piece during our grad school program was called Places to Intervene in a System by Donella Meadows. And so Donella talks about paradigm shifts as one of the most effective ways to intervene in a system. There's sort of 12 leverage points, and paradigm shifts or paradigms is number 2. So what's a paradigm? Paradigm is the shared idea in the minds of society, the great big unstated assumptions, unstated because unnecessary to state, everyone already knows them. These constitute that society's paradigm or deepest set of beliefs about how the world works. So I'm going to share a couple of slides, make sure this works. Move myself out of the way. So what are these are some paradigms that Donella wrote about as examples of our society. This was a while ago, but it still kind of holds true. So money measures something real and has real meaning. Growth is good. Nature is a stock of resources to be converted to human purposes. Evolution stopped with the emergence of Homo sapiens. One can own land. These are all sort of these unstated assumptions that many of us grew up with and that are just sort of woven into the fabric of the way we set up our systems and the way our systems run. And so what I love about paradigm or paradigm shifts when I read this piece for the first time was that how quickly it can change. I've come across some books, podcasts, conversations, things I've done and experienced that have really like shifted the way that I view the world, but also operate in my day-to-day life and my relationships with other people. And so Donella writes that all it takes is a click in the mind, a falling of scales from the eyes, a new way of seeing. Whole societies are another matter, though. They resist challenges to their paradigm harder than they resist anything else. So on the individual level, you can sort of set off that light bulb. And I think this is where a lot of those connecting our wellness and spiritual practices to our work can facilitate that. But as a society, change is really hard to come by. Things are always changing, but not necessarily in the ways that we want them to change. And the systems that are in place are, a lot of people like to say that they're broken, but in fact, they're functioning as designed. And so to change them, Donella writes, in a nutshell, you keep pointing at the anomalies and failures in the old paradigm. You keep coming yourself and loudly and with assurance from the new one, you insert people with the new paradigm in places of public visibility and power. You don't waste time with reactionaries. Rather, you work with active change agents and with the vast middle ground of people who are open-minded. And so I see the Food Systems Leadership Network as a great place to sort of spread ideas about a new paradigm. And I think Nicole is an amazing individual to talk about what that new paradigm might look like, both now and moving forward. And also to point out the failures in the old paradigm, which we'll talk a little about today as well. So just a quick overview. Last month, we did a webinar with Reggie Hubbard, which was amazing. That was sort of tools and practices for radical presence and transformative change. We did a lot of things to, whether you're at your desk, about to have a conversation with someone, if you're at City Hall about to give public comment, ways to sort of open your mind and expand your presence so that you can engage in with more equanimity in your work and your life. So today we'll hear from Nicole. And then in August, we're going to bring in Michelle Auerbach to do some story-based strategy and narrative transformation. That'll be August 22nd, and we'll send out the registration link for that after. Cool. So last session, like I said, we heard from Reggie. about his experience as an activist, political strategist, and spiritual teacher. The recording of that is online. We can send that out after. And we practice simple, accessible actions to facilitate expansiveness in our minds and bodies. And today we're going to learn about some relational food systems practices, why it's important to acknowledge and confront the collapsing features of our current food systems, key principles for moving toward relationship as leaders of change-oriented food systems work. And we're going to do some interactive breakout rooms and also a Q&A with Nicole. So who is Nicole, who's giving us all this wisdom today? I'll introduce Nicole, and then we'll do a quick somatic grounding practice, and then we'll jump into the main part of today. So Nicole Civita is a food systems thinker, experiential educator, applied ethicist, integrative lawyer, and responsive consultant who grounds in ecological knowledge and attends to relationships of care and reciprocity. Nicole's efforts propelled multi-year projects to drastically reduce food waste, revitalize regional food systems, seek justice for agricultural and food workers, which I saw firsthand in grad school, explore ethical dilemmas across the food chain, and develop systems-aware, equity-enhancing laws and policies. She now leads EcoGather, a collapse-responsive, collaborative learning network dedicated to place-based lifeways, the vitality of agro-ecosystems, the change competence of communities, the transition to well-being economies, and the pursuit of collective liberation. After a decade of teaching, she is particularly gratified to have mentored a rising generation of eco-social change shapers. I love that term. The juiciest lessons that she shared with her students are woven throughout her co-authored 2023 book, Feeding Each Other, Shaping Change in Food Systems Through Relationship, which I have right here. It's a little blurry because of my Zoom background, but great book. She maintains a relational food systems consulting practice and is of counsel to Handle Food Law, LLC. So before I hand it over, I'm going to lead us through, I'm going to take a couple of pages out of Reggie's book from last webinar. If everyone wants to turn their cameras off, and we can do a few minutes of somatic grounding practice, sort of get into our bodies, and then we can have more presence for Nicole's presentation and all of our interaction with each other today. So I'm going to try and come off camera too. Cool. So if everyone just sits, you can close your eyes if that feels comfortable. And a big thing I like to do is drop my shoulders, because a lot of us, including myself, keep our shoulders all scrunched up all day. And take a couple deep breaths in through the nose. Hold it. And out slowly through the mouth. Do that a couple of times. And as you breathe, I want you to tune into the sounds around you, the feelings in your body, and sort of think of your experience right now as a cloud of sensation. And one thing we can do as we're breathing is to really move into feeling the heart space in our chest. We often spend most of our days up in our heads, and it can often feel like we're separate from the rest of our body or the rest of our experience. So I really like to think about what's going on in the heart space region. And if we can experience things from there, how does that change our way of seeing or our way of interacting with the world around us? And then we could do a little bit of movement. So last webinar, we started doing some neck circles. I'll come on camera to demonstrate this. So just moving the neck, nice and slow. You might reach a point where there's a bit of a trigger and you can just sort of hang out there. You do a couple of rotations in one direction and then switch. Whatever range of motion is most comfortable for you. And then do the same with the shoulders. We can move them back to front, front to back. We can go side to side. Again, you can do this all from your chair. Or if you're at a standing desk, you can start moving around a little bit more. But just shaking it all out. I know it's early for some of us. It's middle of the afternoon for others. So wherever you are in your day, just get some movement. And then one of my favorites that Reggie did was everyone rub their hands together, gather some energy between your palms. And then wherever you need it most, we did our face. So you could do your chest, your shoulders, your back. Just put that energy there and feel it. And then take a couple more deep breaths. And you can do that whenever you want, especially because we can go off camera on Zoom, so we don't have to seem strange. Great. You can feel free to come back on camera or stay off, but now that we've expanded our awareness a little bit and we feel a little bit more grounded, I'll hand it over to Nicole and we can jump into today's lessons.
Thank you. And thank you so much for bringing Reggie's practices into this space with us today. There's nothing that I appreciate more in a series than continuity and being able to weave the threads of what we're learning and sharing and practicing together. So I'm really grateful for that opening. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for convening this space. And I just have to briefly say that Elias is being way too humble right now. It is both really, really a joy to have someone introduce you and frame up what you're going to do, who you've had the opportunity to mentor, because now there's so many things I don't have to say and explain because there's someone else out in the world doing that work. There's lots of those someone else's, but each doing it in their own way. And Elias was my research assistant on this book. So there was a lot that wouldn't have come together in the way it did if it was not for his collaboration and support. And you'll meet Michelle next time, who is my co-author. And we like to say that we co-authored this book with so many people, with all of the writers and the practitioners and the poets and the artists and the farmers and the doers that we quote and draw wisdom from, and that really the work of writing this piece that I'm going to speak a lot about today was truly a relational creation process. And so it's really important to me to always acknowledge as many of the people and influences that that made that possible. And I think that that's often true for so many of the things we do, but we are in a world and in a paradigm where we are made to claim ownership and authorship over ideas rather than to situate ourselves in a web of thought relationship, and rather than recognize when you start out promoting something like this or talking about it when it publishes, it's all about, well, what did you have to say and why should people read your book? And really I've come to start saying well, when we published our first book, there isn't a second one yet, but there also isn't an end to this work and to this practice. And so I'm hopeful today that we'll have some time to move through this sort of argument, the paradigm shift, and some of the tools in feeding each other. And then also to work with some of those tools together. And then I'd love to be able to tell you sort of what comes after the last page, or what is coming after the last page for me, and some of the things that I'm really grappling with and learning now beyond what we were able to fit in before publication. So if you'll just bear with me for a moment, I'm going to get this screen share going. Nope, that's not the one. One more time. Okay. How's that? We got the slides?
Looks
Excellent.
good.
All right. So we've mentioned this book. Some of you I can see in the participants window I've talked to before. I've read it, I know. For those of you who haven't yet or have a big stack next to your nightstand, the reason we wrote this book was because after a decade of teaching, I never had the text I wanted. And that kept changing the text I wanted, but I really, as I was moving out of sort of full-time food systems teaching, I really wanted to leave behind something that I felt like was an accessible introduction to not just food systems, but food systems thinking, and we'll talk in a moment about that, to complexity theory that had a really strong economic critique and that really put to practice emergent strategy and the lineage of emergent strategy. Some of you probably identify that with Adrienne Maree Brown's excellent book by the same name, but there's a long lineage of emergent strategy thinkers and practitioners. We wanted to also provide context for how all of the isms, the breaking ideologies, work within the food system and create a lot of its functions and behaviors. Then it was really important to me to provide a trauma-informed discussion of our present polycrises, including, but certainly in no way limited to, the climate crisis, and the possibility, and I would argue, the ongoing nature of that unraveling and the collapse of late modernity that we're in right now, collapse being a slow unwinding process, an involuntary sort of decline and retraction. And that is, I think, the most honest way to characterize the age that we're in. But as you'll see in a bit, I also think it's a time of tremendous responsibility and opportunity. So I really wanted to bring forward a very unflinching, collapse-aware, and responsive analysis of what's going on in food systems so that we can show up effectively. And so that we're not all gaslighting each other about what's going on. But to do that requires doing it in a tender and trauma-informed way because it can be really overwhelming. And then to think about the food systems implications of that trajectory. Really important that a lot of the wisdom in this book, yes, tied to the academic literature and the data and the peer-reviewed stuff and the big picture stuff that I'm always supposed to teach, but really sit that right alongside and in parity with wisdom from the natural world, from frontline and affected communities. And then provide not just the like, okay, here's the crap, like here's all the tough stuff, but some guidance and some practices for shifting paradigms from what we call the transactional and extractive paradigm to the relational empathic one, and shaping change in and beyond food systems. And I'll say for anyone who found their way here today and isn't necessarily centrally involved in food systems work, although we're all centrally involved in food systems, all of those practices and many of the change shaping lessons apply well beyond the food system, well beyond sort of economic and social systems or political praxis. I would say one of the things that I'm most happy about through this project was that I've learned to apply a lot of these things in my personal life, and it works really well, it turns out, because we all live, and if you're breathing today, you almost certainly grew up, at least in the global north and in sort of the heart and lungs of empire, you grew up in an overculture that encouraged the degradation of your relational capacity. And so we've all got to rebuild a lot of that. And so that is the work. And so it's important to be able to distinguish transactional and extractive conduct from relational and empathic ways of interacting. And I'm going to try to help you do that a little bit today. And then we won't really get into this today, but the book is chock full of real examples of people and organizations, grassroots movements living into the relational future by moving toward relationship. And I'll say this again, I'll probably say it too many times, but I need you to not walk away from today's presentation and think about transactional and relational as a binary, as an on or off, as you are either being transactional or you're being relational. A transaction is a type of relationship. It's just a really, really eroded, winnowed down, narrow, thin, kind of diluted type of relationship with a whole lot less potential. And so we're existing in a world that wants us always transacting, and we are moving toward a world of relationship. And I am going to pause here I'm encouraging us to provide an example from this morning, because I think it puts a really fine point on this, and it also points to how hard it is to know if someone else is going to meet you in a more nuanced, more complex, more nourishing type of relationality. So I'm a member of a mutual aid group and chat. Loads of folks on there, folks I've never met before. I don't want to call them strangers because I think we're not strange to each other. We're all willing to show up and help in the ways we can outside of formal systems, formal NGOs, the nonprofit industrial complex. And so someone yesterday posted on there needing access to 20 honeybees for an venom-based medical therapy that she needed for an autoimmune condition. And I happen to have very, very healthy hives, and we think of the hive as a superorganism. So removing a couple of bees from it is a normal and healthy thing to do. And I was happy to help with that. So this really lovely woman, drove 25 minutes, showed up at my house this morning with her babies in tow, and I had for her a jar with some honeybees and some food for them and water for them, and like a very humane way to hand this off. We started talking. It became clear that she might need access to bees on a regular basis. And remember, we met in a mutual aid chat. And I was so happy to provide this and, kind of telling her that if she needed to come harvest, we could help her learn how and all of that. And as I was inviting her back, I could tell that like she had been in this relational space with me. And then all of a sudden, the anxiety about it came in. And she said, if this is going to be a thing, I can pay you. I can pay you. If you want to be paid for the bees. And there are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of bees out there. And if she needs 20 of them a couple times a year in order to function and care for her family and show up for work, like that's not something I need to exchange money for or turn into money. And instead, I said, no, just pay it forward. Like just, think about what you can offer. And there was this huge wave of like relief and being seen and being met in the spirit of what brought us together to begin with. But even though this interaction had been set up fully in that way, in a space where we had, all sort of affirmatively agreed that this did not need to be transactional or financialized and reduced to currency, we all still seem to have that nervousness that like, well, maybe we can only do that around the edges. And if it's going to be an ongoing feature, if it's something we're going to sustain, we've got to pull back and go back into those dominant and familiar modes of transacting. And so my invitation is to think about, as we go through some of this, where you're already moving toward relationship, and where you can stay with that move, and where it's not really possible because there are some things that like you need to do quickly and efficiently because of the overculture we work in and the demands put on us. So let's try to hold all of that together. Okay. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because here we are with the Food Systems Leadership Network, and I'm going to expect that folks are familiar with this, but I do find that a lot of times people come into food systems work motivated by a particular concern, a particular goal, or set of feelings, desired impact, and they don't really have the systems thinking and systems theory behind them. So a system is simply an interconnected set of elements coherently organized, though not centrally planned, that works together to achieve something, a goal, right? That moves towards a purpose. It doesn't necessarily need to state its purpose, but you can always figure out its purpose by watching its behavior. And a lot of times when people encounter that definition for the first time, they're like, well, is everything a system? And Donella Meadows gives us one of the best examples for distinguishing a system from a collection or a heap. And the heap is that pile of laundry on your bedroom floor. You keep adding elements to it, dirty socks, some underwear, last night's pajamas. It's not coherently organized, and it's not achieving anything other than probably like annoying the crap out of you and taking some time out of your Sunday that you would rather not spend folding. That's not a system, that's a heap. But the system is achieving something. And when we work in food systems, we're often working with the elements. We're working on a lot of the parts, or some of us do work on the interactions and the connections in supply chains, for example, or charitable food distribution. But the nature of the connections is often not what we're changing. We're just being agents of connection. And most of us think that the purpose of the food system, and when I say the food system singular, I mean the global behemoth one that we've got right now, that the food system goal is to feed the world. And the folks with the most power and influence and access and who profit the most tell us that that is the goal all of the time. And I believed it for a lot of years. I really, truly believed it. And I think many of the individual humans, even the ones who have the jobs and the roles that I might not agree with, I think on some level, they often think, well, yes, we have to make these trade-offs and we have to, do some stuff that's not so great, but we're feeding the world. Like that is in fact our goal. But I think that's part of the unstated assumptions that Elias was talking about before. And so I think if we start to look at, and I know most of you are already very immersed in this, the behavior of the system and the panoply of persistent problems, food system failures, issues that are out there, we can recognize that the goal can't possibly be to feed the world, at least not the primary one, because if it was, we'd be a whole lot closer to that. So when I define a food system, for me, there's so many maps out there, and I'm really grateful for the people who make them because I'm not good at that. And I've taught from them for a long time, but usually they wind up overwhelming me. And so for me, a food system or food systems are, and we can look at it at nested levels, interconnected webs of people, coexistent species, more than humans, elements, land, water, air, fire, and activities that extend across all the domains involved in providing human nourishment, supporting ongoing vitality, and expressing comestible or edible culture. That probably sounds a little bit different than the textbook definition, and there are lots of reasons for that. And I'd like you to notice that there's no talk of public health, ecosystem services, resources, or anything else that we've instrumentalized in this version of a food system definition. And just hold with that for a minute. Okay, but getting a little more practical, we think about the domains within the food system. And as you look at this list, I'm not going to read it out. I want you to think about which domains your work and your rising leadership within food systems is most involved in. Are you focused on seed saving and keeping in seed production? Are you focused on food recovery and reintegration or upcycling? Are you focused on trade? Are you focused on food preparation? Where do you sit in all of that? And then, and of course, some of you will be across many of those. And then recognize that even though you may be in one or just a few of those domains, that everything you do is based on energy from a single source, which is the sun, often converted into plant life, plant energy, fossilized into fuels that are embedded well below the surface of the earth, which we've been borrowing from with heedlessly for this whole industrial food system period. The health of all of the supporting ecosystems that make all of it possible. And that's goes well beyond just whether you are land-based and in a primary production capacity. Certainly here in Vermont, where it now catastrophically floods every summer, we're learning that flooding is a tremendous disruption, and the ecosystem imbalances are tremendous disruptions to trade and distribution and storage and packing and processing and all of those pieces too. Knowledge and systems of knowledge and types of knowledges, and then all of the human and animal labor that goes into that. And so each of those domains on the outside of the ones that we work within are ones we have to start looking at our relationships to and changing our relationships with. And it should probably go without saying in this crowd that food systems reflect and respond to social, cultural, political, economic, health, and environmental conditions. And some of those environmental conditions, for example, are becoming a lot more constrained, a lot more volatile, and changeable. Many of our health conditions are becoming we are the canaries in the coal mine on the health pieces, or we can see how we've seen in this decade how a global pandemic impacts food systems, and then how quickly we want to forget that that's what happens and go back to business as usual. So these systems are not static, even though they have a goal. They're always moving and changing and reshaping in response to those things. And we, as the agents and the leaders within those systems, are part of navigating and steering those responses. Okay, let's take a pause of my voice. And I'd love for you to all share in the chat for just a moment why food matters to you in the wider world. And this is not a moment for because we all have to eat, which is lovely, but let's go beyond that. What's the issue, the thing, the challenge, the fundamental irreconcilable irony, that data point that once you heard, you could not look away? What's the thing that brought you into this work? It can be the thing that sits at the heart of the work you do today. It could be the thing that you hope will sit at the heart of the next job that you get to have or that you do on your volunteer time. Or it could be the thing that makes you show up for something like this, even if you're not actively working within or studying within the food system today. Let's just take a moment, and I'm gonna keep this chat while we do to share a little bit about that. So I see Taylor coming at us with the climate emissions piece, right? That's an enormous one. We understand the harm and the opportunity there. Any others? Okay, all of the interconnection. And for me, Liskin, that was one of the things that really brought me in deep early too. And it was oh, not only is it all interconnected, but this is such an accessible place to help people see those interconnections. The fact that it's essential to life, the fact that it's a tool for culture and knowledge transfer, but also the double-edged piece Ashley's pointing out: cultural destruction, ecocide, genocide, impacts of diet-related diseases on people's physical health and on their mental health, Andrew's offering us. I think that's a really important one to bring in. So there's a lot of what I'm seeing a lot here is, oh, Elias, he's got the one that I think gets a lot of people in here, right? The fact that we have way more than enough, and yet there is so much hunger, there's so much malnutrition. Species endangerment, right? Mass extinction and agriculture's role in driving that. Some of us coming from a really personal place and understanding in an embodied, very somatic way what the dysfunctions of a functioning food system are doing inside of our bodies. Yes, absolutely. Okay, keep those coming. I'm gonna just put a couple slides up here that I don't think we need to linger over for too long. But here is that, like, we've got the food, yet we have hundreds of millions, rising back up to over 1 billion hungry people. We've got 2.5 billion with inadequate diets, and 20% of deaths that are deemed premature are related to poor diet. Meanwhile, 28% of humans on the planet in this rough time period are employed in agriculture, and just a tiny, tiny number of corporations dominate post-production. There's lots of great work on that, and I'm happy to share some links afterwards if you need more on that. And then, of course, well over 1 billion tons of food lost or wasted each year, which amounts to 1.5 quadrillion calories of food that goes uneaten a year, which is a crazy number. There's so many zeros. I don't know any other statistics in my world that use quadrillions because I'm not like an astrophysicist. And so the mismatch is tremendous. And then here are the environment pieces. We're using 37% of the Earth's land mass, and in that, 25% of agricultural lands and soils are degraded. Anywhere, I use the low end number here so that when people want to argue with me, I don't have to have the argument, but anywhere from 24 to 33% of greenhouse gas emissions are coming from the food system. 70% of consumptive freshwater use is for agriculture, and a substantial percentage of that is applied to food that then ultimately goes to waste. And there's this weird proportionality thing. It takes 10 calories on average to produce 1 calorie of industrial food, 10 calories of energy, typically fossil energy, to produce 1 calorie of food. Not efficient. There's just 12 plant species make up 75% of the plant-based foods we consume, out of like countless species that can provide us with really good nutrition. Same thing on the mammal and bird side, just 15 species making up 90% of all livestock consumed. And then this one, we spend 97% more on junk food marketing in the United States, at least, than on public health messaging or nutrition education. So no wonder somebody's profiting from all of that. Now, this is like the quick rundown. And there's so much more of this, and we do it in the book. We do it in a whole chapter, and it feels awful. It's an awful thing to read. It's an awful thing to teach. It's a terrible thing to encounter in your first semester of graduate school. And then everyone comes to me with lots of anxiety and depression. And that's when I realized we couldn't spend as much time on all of this, and that it really wasn't worth my energy to always be updating these statistics and reading the latest paper to see if it was in fact 24% of greenhouse gas emissions or 28%, or like the time spent figuring out just how bad it all is not time well spent at all. And so I update this set of slides, these 2 slides, like maybe twice a year now, and maybe not, because this gives you enough of a sense of where we are. Our attention needs to move. But let's go back to some of the lessons Reggie shared with us. Let's observe what was happening in your body when we focus on those big picture implications. How many of you felt like you were going to start to reach back for those net rolls or the little cash reiki energy practice, right? Because something's tightening up. Even, my own inflammation and this lingering cough I can't get rid of is triggered at that stress that comes centrally in our bodies when we think about how bad it is and how far that bad spreads, right? Because of the interconnectedness. So I want to do something a little different. Warning. That's about 90 seconds. And I would love for you, if you're walking around your kitchen, you're piling papers in your workplace, just to come forward to your screen and give your presence to this short video, which is mostly clips of my morning put together. All right. Take a moment to just reflect on the learning we did about how to come into your body and my best virtual attempt at helping you connect to the wider earth body that we are all a part of. When I asked my friend to edit those clips together for me this morning, I said, make them all slightly uncomfortably long. Go past the point where you as a video editor would normally say, okay, that's enough. They understand bees now. That's enough. They understand the way chicks move now. And let's linger. Let's be long. Let's sit with it and see what starts to happen and what starts to shift. And if there wasn't so much I wanted to do in this period of time we have together, I probably would have given you the full 15 minutes I spent with my face in the chicken brooder this morning, just watching those 2-day-old chicks learn how to be alive and be with each other and feed themselves and respond to their natural instinct to hydrate and drink water and to figure out how to come together for warmth. To marvel at the incredible shared labor of a beehive, right? And shared labor that happens across some really rigid roles and really different systems of eusocial organization than the ones that we're familiar with. So I really think about like moving from a focus on your body, which is so important and we should focus on, to our connections to the wider earth body. And I saw in the chat before someone talking about kinship and kinning. And of course, yes, that language and those practices and concepts are really, really important in all of this. To thinking about what it means to be embodied earth, and that we can only do that if we embody relationship, if we are relationship embodied. From there, I like to think about the fact that it's not just our physical, corporeal selves that need nourishment. It's not just our spiritual selves that need nourishment, but our relations need nourishment. We need to nourish the spaces between us as humans, between us and our more than human kin. And then we need nourished lineages. We need to nourish across lineal ancestral time and do a lot of healing there. And for some of us, reckoning with a lot of really terrible, persistent harms perpetuated by those in our ancestral lines, but also not reducing them, the people in our ancestral lines, to their worst behaviors, to their optimization of the paradigm of their time, and instead looking back at the wisdom and the practices that they have to offer. And once we start to think about lineal time and deeper earth time, we can start to realize that time comes in spirals as opposed to just a linear trajectory, which opens up a whole lot of possibility beyond the kind of time and timeline that we often find ourselves in late modernity and in the era of under-responded to climate crisis. I'll pause to just say that about a year ago, a little less than a year ago, I was writing a grant to do some work on climate and food systems education and change shaping. And it was a big grant and it was a multi-year grant. In fact, it was, I think, a 6-year possible funding cycle, a really big one. And I wrote it the way I would usually write it. And then I got to the part where you had to chunk out the activities into each grant year. And I realized that, like, I can't still be doing this stuff in 6 years and have this kind of approach to education be for the purposes of the kind of mobilization that this funder wanted and for the policy facing outcomes and education be worth it. Like, I can't sit here and map out a grant that says in 2029, we're going to be doing like functionally very similar things, because it doesn't work. And I think a lot of us know that. And so we've internalized this sense of terrible urgency that comes from the catastrophic projections of really facing the climate crisis. But to quote my friend Dougal Hine, the end of the world as we know it is not the end of the world. And I think we all have to, as Bayo Akamalafe says, slow down. Times are urgent. We must slow down. And by getting a whole lot slower, which, if for those of you who do know me here, like this is a do as I say, not as I do. This is the medicine I need to take. I have hustled for years. Getting a whole lot slower is the lesson of this time in this moment. And you cannot be relational unless you slow down. And so a lot of times when I talk to folks who are operating and trying to do really good work within the existing paradigm, they're like, oh my God, I want anything but relationality. I don't have time for relationality. And I think like our species story doesn't have time or space for us not to reclaim our relational capacity. And so there is a real need to compost our desires for achievement, success, getting it right, solving the problems, and all of those things, and an equal need for us to bring more people in to the slow work of relationality and care. And I know I say that while we're moving vast quantities of palm oil on shipping containers, in between continents. I know that I'm saying all of this stuff that on one level can feel really Pollyannish, but I spent a lot of time working with, executives at Mars and Danone and all of these places. And I'm not sure what any of their work is for, because it's not the only way to feed people. And we're trying consistently to solve the problems in those jobs, those roles I have inhabited, roles my clients inhabit, roles my former students inhabit. We're all trying to make better, make less harmful, to blunt the edges of a system, a behemoth system that is collapsing under its own weight. And so I think we all have to learn how to walk in two worlds. The one that we find ourselves in, where we have to go to work and meet our material needs and earn income because we're not provided for and we're not providing for each other, and how to walk our way out of those worlds. And this is a really different kind of ask than getting a little greener or being more sustainable. And it's going to require really different capacities in us. I just jumped ahead a lot, but it felt like a moment where we had to share that and focus on that a little bit. So Elias did a really great job on paradigm. I'm not going to go over this again, other than to say, if it feels slippery to you, transactional extractive paradigm, agri-capitalist paradigm, just know that it's the water we swim in. You're a fish, you don't know you're wet. Or you have an inkling that you're wet, but you don't know that it's possible to be anything other than wet, right? And that there is life on land, to abuse the metaphor a little bit. What I do want to linger on here is Elias introduced the concept of leverage points. And in these slides, which I'll make sure you get access to, there's a link to the reading that he was talking about. Donella talks about all the leverage points where we can make change in the system. And the ones that are sort of closer in and have the higher numbers, right? The constants and parameters, the buffer sizes, those are all easier to change. We can change the buffer size and the volume of food that we're producing and that we have access to. We can change material stocks and flows, the relative delays and feedbacks in the system. But they're not going to make transformative change in the system. You got to go all the way out to the far end here to start to get to transformation. And And I think a lot of us play in the space around 5, 6, the info flows and the rules of the system. How do we educate people? How do we teach people? How do we reconnect them to food culture? How do we do policy work? How do we get a better farm bill? How do we do local food policy work? Some of us are trying to change the structures of the system. We build food hubs and co-ops and things like that. I think too few of us are questioning the goals of the system, both the global food system and sometimes the relocalized food systems that we participate in too, because we're asking these incumbents, these alternative players, to functionally compete to survive against the behemoth. And we throw them little bits of support and aid in the form of all the tiny lines in the farm bill and some philanthropy to help these things. And we make everybody run around and justify their work and raise their funds and do all their things. But we've never changed the structure and the goal. And so it's really, really hard. And so many of us have been doing really, really good work for decades now, and handing off those batons. And we're not really seeing the outcomes we want to see on the scale or with the depth of change that we feel should be possible. And that's because we haven't interrogated the goals of the system. And then so finally, I think to do that really well, you actually have to go a step further out and focus on paradigm and mindset. Unless you think that I'm here thinking like I've done the most enlightened thing possible and I'm encouraging you to join me, that's not the last place. And in fact, there's a real danger to getting stuck in thinking that paradigm shift and shifting to a relational paradigm is the be all end all, because what Donella tells us is that she uses the word power. I would prefer humility, to transcend your paradigm and sit humbly in the recognition that you do not know everything that is possible to know, even when you write the book or apply the lessons or do the things, and that like you're going to keep learning, and that there's deep time and wide cosmos well beyond the comprehension of any single human lifetime. And so you have to also be willing to continually question what you know and constantly bring in new perspective and new information. And so, you know, at present, I don't think there's a moment when I'm going to like disavow all of this. But I have to stay humble enough to say, hey, you know, there are parts of that that like I'm going to need to rethink later. And I want you to all do that too. Okay, here's where I make people mad. This is a list of the solutions that will not necessarily save us. And I'm sorry, I know some of you are working on some of these things and some of you hate others of these things. I've worked on many of these things, so guilty. Here are some things that will not fix the food system. The items on this list may surprise you, but we like some of these things and are deeply skeptical of others. They all share a commonality. When enacted in an extractive, transactional, competitive, global, neoliberal capitalist system, none of these solutions are likely to make much of a difference at all. You have the list in front of you, so I don't have to read it. Some of these could, when enacted relationally, absolutely move us in the right direction. But no one of them is so heavy duty that when they are introduced into the machine of extractive capitalism, would jam the works, prevent extraction, end supremacy and inequality, and save us. We are not going to find an end to hunger inside the system that maintains it. And we're not going to solve any of the problems that we list in detail in chapter 2, that you all listed in the chat, if we keep thinking we can save extractive capitalism at the same time. As Raj Patel and Jason W. Moore have proven in their book, A History of the World and 7 Cheap Things, capitalism is not just an economic system, but a way of organizing the relations between humans and the rest of nature. So we don't rethink how we're organizing those relations, we're not going to get there. That doesn't mean that some of these things aren't part of moving toward relationship. Of course they are, but none of them is the silver bullet. And when we show up for work or when we have to go prepare ourselves to be the person who gets the job, to do the thing that feels really, really at least fulfilling and challenging and good, we have to sort of act like we have the solution and our solution is the solution. And that's how we raise the capital or get the grants or encourage people to change their policy. And so because we have to perform that, we get bought in and it changes stuff inside our mind. And it stores things inside of our bodies and we lose sight of that key insight. So take a moment and think about how you feel about this. Are you surprised? Are you angry? Question mark. Are you relieved? Are you mad? Do you disagree? And it's totally fine to disagree. I'm not going to pause here because there's more I want to get to, but if you do, feel free to fire it off in that chat. And when I do send you off into breakout rooms, I'm going to read all that disagreement. But I always like to hear how this sits with people, because this is the, you know, sort of proverbial slaughtering of the sacred cows. And I don't recommend desecrating things, but I think it's important that we all sit with this and get really, really frank about it with each other. Okay, a couple more terms I want to like distinguish and disaggregate. We often say agriculture and food systems, and that we have in the modern period an agricultural food system, right? And we distinguish that from more hunting and gathering, nomadic based blended food systems. So agriculture then is the art, science, culture, and practice of cultivating soil, growing crops, raising livestock. Fine. It became, especially in the last couple decades, really, really popular, sharp to distinguish agriculture from agribusiness, right? And thinking about agribusiness then as the entire value chain involved in producing commodified biological products and delivering them to end consumers and generating a financial product. But I think that as sharp as we thought we were being when we said, wait, this isn't agriculture, it's agribusiness, we were still missing, like, what was the tune the agribusiness was all dancing to, right? And what's it all nested inside? What's that paradigm? What are those unstated assumptions? And so we argue that we don't have an agricultural food system. There is no culture, like land-based, lineal culture, place-based culture, intergenerational culture. Rather, we have global agri-capitalism, a global growth-oriented, financialized, efficiency-centered system for externalizing harm and extracting profits, right, from the land and from living beings under the auspices of that goal of feeding the world. But I don't think that's what we're actually doing. Okay, she's talking about capitalism, so now she's scary, because if she's talking about capitalism critically, she must be advocating for state communism, because we live in a binary world and there could only possibly be two options. Let's be more imaginative than that, please. There is no way that there's only two ways to organize the world, like global capitalism or state communism, and that's the whole scope of our options. But people would like us to believe that, because if we believe that state communism, and I'm saying state communism, pointing to the certain historical experiments in places like the USSR, in places like China, that like, okay, we're pretty harmful in some ways while trying to put into practice ideas that run counter to the individualism and extraction of capitalism. So we in the US have all been brought up to believe that that's terrible and that's the boogeyman. It's a false binary. And there are things we can learn from the good parts of what capitalism has brought us. There are things we can learn from the good parts of what communism brings us. And we can also say, wait a second, we're going to look back further at how humans organize themselves before the whole conversation became structured along that binary. But before we do any of that, I think it's really important just to recognize that capitalism isn't just markets and private enterprise. Capitalism isn't just like being an entrepreneur or having a business. Rather, it's an economic system in which a relatively small number of people profit by enclosing commons, extracting from the land, and leveraging the labor of others. So there's a small class of capitalists, and then there's all of the rest of us. it's also really important to note that it is necessarily and fundamentally based on accumulation by dispossession and oppression. Therefore, it requires frontiers, because once it is dispossessed and or oppressed and extracted, it uses stuff up and it's got to go look somewhere else. And so that's what the whole global colonial project has been about. It is why the North underdeveloped the South and then said, oh, we'll do a whole bunch of development NGO stuff and try to make up for it. And it is also, and if you want lots of backup and data on that, Jason Hickel is the man to go see. Really great new paper on quantifying all of that. But it also, especially speaking from my experience as an American, offers a set of promises, the idea of upward mobility and the idea that progress and a good life will be available to everyone eventually, that we just haven't gotten there yet. But it doesn't necessarily ask us to question who is the everyone, right? Who is that for? And so I think Vanessa Andreotti says that a lot depends, I'm paraphrasing her here, on whether you believe that that promise can no longer be met, like we're confronting biophysical limits of the planet and it can no longer be met, or whether you understand that it was always a fraudulent promise. It was always false all along, because it was always premised on peoples elsewhere, and typically black and brown peoples in the global South or enslaved elsewhere, to suffer the plunder of their places, of their bodies, of their labor, so that we could have what looked like development and upward mobility and comfort and ease in certain parts of the world. That's a lot. And it's not that nobody else is talking about this. Of course, these conversations are happening, but they don't often happen as candidly, as frankly, as I'm encouraging us to have them, or at least confront these concepts right now. So if you're still with me and you recognize that the food system that most of us are trying to make change within or evolve beyond is in fact an agri-capitalist food system, then we can reckon with well, all these things that we're all concerned about, they're all things that agri-capitalism doesn't actually hate. Because they're all part of the system and necessary to a system of extraction. To do all of this, it's not just the sort of pure and objective economic system alone. It works with a whole bunch of accomplices that many of us are really motivated to address as well, right? Imperialism, coloniality, racism, white supremacy, whole list right here. All the way down to carceralism and binaryism. And so it's really important to recognize that we're not necessarily fighting a whole bunch of different fights right now. They're all interconnected, because all of these isms, all of these ideologies are upholding and fueling agri-capitalism and bringing us to the brink. Okay. So, as Elias said at the beginning, nothing and everything is wrong, right? The system is not broken. It is fueled by breaking ideologies. They're functioning as intended. But the good news is that breaking ways eventually break themselves. They eventually break so much around them that we can see them for what they are, and they wear themselves out, right? There's only so much in this world to take, to break, to foul, to obliterate. We can only push people to so much precarity before the whole thing collapses on itself. There's that word again. Michelle and I encourage you, and she'll probably talk about this next month, to think about collapse just as a type of trouble we're already living in. The kind of trouble that advances the plot of a story, that cracks things open, and that reveals the futility of our resistance to change, and not just to little change, but to really, really big change. And so when we think about the first primary change we're asking folks to take on, it's to say, let's stop trying to feed the world. And that doesn't mean let's stop caring about people in other parts of the world, but it is in part saying, let's stop thinking we can tell people in other parts of the world how they should be feeding themselves and their each others, right? That like if we actually focus on food being, yes, more place-based, and more relational, and this does not necessarily mean that local food is always the answer, but if we shift the goal, we're going to have an easier time moving in to and embodying the new paradigm. Okay. Let me pause here for a minute. Oh no, one more thing. So the global local, let me clean this up a little bit. The global food systems transnational, lots of large actors, focuses on economies of scale, mechanization, industrialization, lots of technological innovation and technology that's not yet necessarily appropriately scaled for human operations, standardization, anonymization, commodification, externalizing of harms, really input intensive. We're not just using what we have where we are, and based on enclosure. Local, very attractive and alluring to many of us, place-based, more human and community scale, focused on economies of need, very labor intensive, which can be really hard on our bodies and can be hard to do with equity and justice in mind, especially inside of an extractive system as the incumbent, tends to be more craft oriented, appropriate technology. There's usually more variety, less commodification. The actors in a local food system have an easier time becoming known to each other. Things can be more specific and specifically adapted to an ecoregion. The harms are more necessarily internalized because you have to live where those harms happen. It's easier, though not easy, to make things more circular. And there's more necessary connection, and things are less sort of attenuated, so values can come along with the material movement of food and of surplus. I am encouraging us to think about cosmolocalism in food system. And this is a term that comes out of the design build space, knowledge commons, open sourcing. It's not a term that's popular in food systems at all. But the idea is that we want to create a world of many worlds where things are small, diverse, place-centric, but also open and connected. So much less enclosure, so much less intellectual property and patenting, and so much less time spent on branding and marketing and all of these things, that we largely feed ourselves, feed each other locally, but that there is some specialized exchange across regions, which both helps to build and activate solidarities and the good side of the idea of a global community, and that we share and participate in a knowledge commons so that the parts of what we think of as the good side of development these days, the ideas, the ways to adapt to a volatile and changing world, are being openly and widely shared across people who are trying to relocalize and get more relational in their places. So how do we start to move toward relationship? In our book, we identify this set of relational moves. And this is really the meat of the learning in the book. It's hard to do inside of a short period of time. But what I would like to do now is send you out into some breakout rooms and give you a link to both these instructions and a set of slides that will introduce you to each of those concepts. And I'd like you in your group to discuss your assigned move, and then pick one person who's going to share back a little summary of what that move is, and try to offer one clear example of what that looks like from a group member's work or experience. And if you can't find one in the food system, look outside. If you can't find one that actually happened, try to imagine what that could look like, And if you can't figure it out, come back with a question. Does that make sense? Okay, so let me stop this share. All right. I'm excited to hear back from different groups about the moves and how you think about them, because I've spent a lot of time reading the authors and practitioners whose work those are all based on. And then we've translated them in our work, but it's always really interesting to see how they land with other people and how they then express them back. And I think it is in that exchange, right? This is why I don't like, if you want to hear me talk through them, you can read that in the pages. It's actually much more interesting and dimensional if we have a conversation around what those moves are as an early way to begin practicing them. So, who was in the first group? And who's reporting out there? All right, Ashley.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley, and I was with Max in the first group, and we talked about connected knowing. And it was a really great conversation, especially since Max is a little bit further along than me in my journey. I just graduated with my BS, so it was great to talk about all different sorts of things. And when we talked about connected knowing, which really came down to looking, like putting yourself in someone else's shoes, part of the conversation was, knowing that is that we might be an expert in your field or feel like we are, but that doesn't mean we have to shut out everyone else, and that we can always learn from other people. And we talked sort of about how shifting this paradigm is going to look like questioning authority and credibility, and also understanding that this work is interdisciplinary, and therefore we don't always have to preach to the choir, and we also need to open our own ears and hear from other people. And like Nicole, you had said earlier, introducing new perspectives. So it was nice to talk about that more and see what connecting knowing looked like.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think one of the key pieces of connected knowing that is important is that often when we are schooled in the scientific method, we are told to be objective. We are told we have to take ourselves out of it, our positionality out of it, in order to try to have some perfect kind of objective, rational, reasoned knowledge that like is unassailable. And that is one way of knowing more about the world, but it is by far not the only way. And so actually stepping out of that dispassionate, unbiased observation and actually like taking a moment to bias yourselves in favor of what the other person is saying. And I've had a really interesting, challenging experience with this. It probably at this point in the proceeding will not come as a surprise that I am like a fairly radical leftist and more oriented towards social anarchy than other things. And yet there've been a lot of folks showing up in our community who are real adherents of like, and really passionately excited about the new right. And I have a lot of like instinctive reactions to some of the things that I associate with that. But I've had to figure out how to like build those bridges and grow community with them. Otherwise, where I'm just an agent of polarization too. And so trying to listen to and learn more from folks that I, have some skepticism about sometimes because of certain things I've heard them say and preach and advance and advocate. But to practice being biased toward their point of view and trying to get inside of it to understand where we actually share many of the same concerns, and then more clearly see like where we're diverging and why, and figuring out how to have conversations that might pull us closer together. So that connected knowing is not about being objective. And Ashley, I think you said not about feeling like you have to be right or have all of those answers. And it's really important. Is something you wanted to add?
And just one more thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you don't mind. I guess looking at that last bullet point too, we were saying like empathy precedes critique but does not displace it. I think that this value of connected knowing helps us not romanticize or tokenize, and also on the other side helps us not immediately dismiss and reject. And so finding that balance.
Yeah. And it's really hard for those of us who are like very online folks or who succumb to the social media algorithms where like we are supposed to critique, we are supposed to plant our flags, we are, in our filter bubbles and things. And so this becomes like, this shouldn't be that radical or difficult or transformative of practice, but because of both the sort of scientific objectivity and the reinforcing algorithmic culture, and a lot of, I would say, I'll, you know, bring critique for the very rules-based social justice culture that has evolved and developed in recent years, where there's so much, you know, needing to perform the right way to do it. Like, we're so quick to critique, and we don't allow ourselves to relate or really express empathy first and to change our minds and our positions. So really important. Was there an example of that you wanted to share, or is that a good exploration?
I feel like that's good for now, unless Max wants to add anything.
All right. Who was in the second group? You had
That
a pair. Oh, hi, Taylor.
Hi, that was me. And if the other folks in that group want to introduce themselves.
There's
Meg.
Meg too.
My name's Meg.
Hi, Jessica's here too.
Great.
Hi, Jessica. Yeah, it was great to talk to you all.
This is a pair of concepts, and so I gave you guys like the extra homework.
Oh, this is a pair. We just talked about targeted universalism.
All
'cause I
right, then
thought
you
there
do that and I'll do the other one.
Okay, I thought there were two on one slide. So targeted universalism, establish a universal goal for all groups concerned affected. Target strategies for achieving those goals based upon how different groups are situated. We thought an example of the first part, a universal goal, was the UN's International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which guarantees the right to adequate food, whatever that means, and that by creating a universal goal, you then therefore necessarily need to localize it in order to achieve it, and that could come through Jessica mentioned food policy councils as a way to sort of bring that down to the local level and get people on the ground who are directly affected involved in or like leading the creation of the strategy to solve that problem.
Great. That's a really good example. And group 3, I will come to you for the other half of this, because it sounds like you read the slides in the same way too. So I like how you use the example of like a giant international body and its goal setting, and then coming down to the more local function of a food policy council, where a lot of the ground truthing can happen. And I think I would maybe take it a step further to say that like we could think about a local food policy council as being informed by those goals and principles, but maybe needing to be in a process of really like figuring out what they mean, as opposed to the thing that often happens where like, oh, here's the expert paralysis and there's a group of experts somewhere, I don't know, in Rome, they meet, they do a thing and they hand this down to us, and so we have to take this thing on. And so in my more cosmolocal vision of the world, I would say that like we're sort of accomplishing that now there. And what would happen if like we actually allowed our local groups, including food policy councils, to set some local goals, which might or might not sound exactly like the ones that are the globally coordinated ones, because they might actually need to be place-based and culturally expressed in different ways. And then some of that that distinction in approach is actually happening more at the neighborhood level, or if your food policy council is statewide, at the county level, right? And thinking about playing with the different scales at which we can practice targeted universalism, which is a concept that John A. Powell of the Othering and Belonging Institute really articulates beautifully. So group 3, the ground truthing is part of how we actually get to do targeted universalism. Let us know what you thought about all that.
Yeah, hi, this is Andrew, and I was with Betty. We were talking about, we started talking about the issue of composting on Long Island, and where Betty lives, and exploring like how could she engage change around that, and it's like based on her perspective, wanting to ground truth, like what do elected leaders or officials think? Are they aware of composting, and like what are the issues that come up for them around it? Because like the information you shared earlier, Nicole, was like really great perspective and statistics that you could just go and share those at a city hall meeting, but you could get written off because it's like not really tailored to that area. So it's like, how can you use ground truthing to tailor the message based on the people you're trying to convince, and also other residents or people in the neighborhoods about why it's important to them. So it was, yeah, just using it to get perspective around that. Betty,
That's awesome. And Betty, that's such a great example to bring forward, because one of the things that I think can be really useful, now we can go back from ground truthing to connected knowing, and recognize that if you want to be able to show up and have that conversation, you don't necessarily, you're right to think that like, okay, these national or international statistics about food waste and composting are only going to take us so far in solving our local challenges around how to create a more virtuous circle here. And so then a lot of the instinct I have found in doing local food work over the years has been like, okay, well then let's get the local government to appropriate money so we can do a study and we can see how bad the problem is here and we can figure out and like, we spend so much time doing that instead, because we have to justify the investment, we have to do all these things, instead of doing more of the ground truthing in a space where like folks have shown up and say, okay, wait, like no shame, no blame, but how many of you are putting most of your excess food in the trash and is it landing in landfill? And if we can find out in that temperature taking moment that like that's actually what's going on in most houses, and we can do some quick surveying about like what the barriers to doing something else with it are, we don't necessarily have to have the perfect objective data on everything to take any action at the local level. And I feel like that's another place where we've replicated some of that expert paralysis, and made even the pursuit of knowledge and local knowledge transactional as opposed to community based. And so that's part of how your example was a really perfect tee up for how I can put both of those concepts all together. So thank you.
I also want to add that because I'm in higher ed, it's an opportunity for me to be more vocal in the classroom, so that one person, I was telling Andrew, even if you impact one person, it's better than zero before.
Absolutely.
So by bringing up the issue and just having the conversation makes just a person cognizant of what they're doing, and then it can spill over like a domino effect. So I thought that was interesting as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think often in those spaces, and having inhabited them for a long time, like there's a little bit of hesitation, like, can I even bring that up? Is that, and then I think when we look at, when we compare the decorum element of it to just the magnitude of what we're facing and how we really do all have to work together, and not in a like individual behavior change is the only thing we have to do, but it is part of the mix of how we move toward relationship, right? It's a systemic problem. We're all off the hook. These are individual solutions that are being sold to you. It's how do we be in relationship with these organic substances that need to be returned to the earth, that didn't make it that way through our bodies, right? Like it's a different way of thinking about it, for sure. All right, so group 4, I have clearly screwed up the counting on all of this, but group 4, I think you probably skipped over universal, or did you do universal reciprocity? Let me figure out where you landed.
Yeah, we
Oh, you
did that
did.
one.
Great. Go ahead.
Yeah, it looks like Katie had to drop off, but I'll share a little bit about what she shared. Yeah, we talked a lot on this one about how just the knowledge, sort of the interconnectedness of everything being actually really scientific, but also like we study ecosystems, we sort of know all the ways in which we're interdependent and in interbeing with other things, but it's also just the sense you get when you do these practices, whether individual, communal, or like a lot of the spiritual work too. But yeah, Katie shared a story about working. She's an urban grower and was often is alone on her half acre, alone in the human sense, but she was talking about some cover cropping that she's been doing and how a few birds have been returning over and over and sort of like being really playful with like certain stuff she's built on the land. And so, yeah, we got to talking a lot about just how it's a really good reminder that we're surrounded and like in community with so much life beyond like human to human relationships. I like the bullet point that said 1, 2, 4, and many-legged relations, because we have so much to give back to that community, but also it's one of the ones that we exploit the most. So it's like we're on both ends of the spectrum there when it comes to reciprocity. I don't know if my group wanted to share anything else from our conversation, but I really like this concept.
Feel free to jump in if you want to add anything else. I'll say that this particular formulation came from Chris Newman. There are so many Indigenous thinkers who offer different formulations of this. And I just read for the second time Tyson Yunkaporta's Sand Talk. And if you haven't encountered that work, I would highly recommend it. I don't feel at all equipped, even on my second reading, to summarize any of it or speak to it for you or for all of that wisdom, but I feel it doing its work inside of me. And I think Patty Krawick's Becoming Kin is great on this. Of course, so many of us are familiar with and moved by Braiding Sweetgrass and Robin Wall Kimmerer's work, and many of the authors in the Kinship series produced by the Center for Humans and Nature all really like help us come into a deeper understanding of this. And I'll just share a really quick anecdote of a person I work with in our community here. He tells me that one of the ways he practices this, he works the place he works abuts a dairy CAFO. And one of the ways he's started practicing universal reciprocity is not just by like fighting about CAFOs and trying to change. He goes out and he reads poetry to the cows. And like, I recognize, and he recognizes that saying that sounds borderline absurd in the paradigm we're in. But he stands there, and some of his coworkers do too, and friends do too, and has an emotional connection with these animals that have been treated like nothing other than inputs and like completely violated in how their life force gets to manifest. And he says it's like a really beautiful and simultaneously subversive practice. And he keeps, like getting worried that someone's going to kick him off the fence line and not let him read to the cows. But I love that story because it invites us to play with these things so differently. And just to figure out, well, whether or not it's actually materially helping the cow, I don't know. He doesn't know. He said the cows seem to like it, but it is changing something in how he understands to show up and what he can talk about in the world. And it cracks open a wider range of relational possibility. Okay, there was one more group, I think, right? And I gave you pleasure to work with.
Yeah, we focused on the pleasure slide, and we had some great conversations around just the greater association with pleasure and food, resisting any kind of attempts to shame actors within the food system or consumers of food with shame, and then had conversations about the last note under enticing, and how we've talked. I think many of us have talked at length about food as being a convener of community and how powerful that is. The example that we hope to share is, well, one, we work on behalf of school communities, around the country. And some of the best engagement methods that we have with kiddos and food is through experiential activities that are focusing on fun and play. So playing with food, or playing with the production of food, or playing with the natural areas or settings where food, grows in a wild sort of way, and letting that do all the work for us, because there's this innate connection with that kind of activity and the provision of food that's sort of just part of it. And how, yeah, taste testing can work, sure, but I think it is more data driven that kids get their hands dirty or have some sort of association with pleasure and fun, in the cultivation or the preparation of food, and then everything that goes on after that, which is eating and connecting and everything like that. So yeah, one example that we wanted to highlight in terms of pleasure being a theme within food.
I love that. And I love that you went to the cultivation for the pleasure, right? And not just the gustatory experience, because often we think about the labor of the cultivation, and that side of the work, but there is so much pleasure in it when we're doing it at a different pace and in a different context, than unfortunately the way in which most agricultural laborers are made to engage with it in a commodified and extractive system. And so it's really important to recognize that we can find pleasure in, I find so much pleasure, for example, in seed keeping, and seed saving and the winnowing and the drying and all of that. That is a really tactile, sensory, beautiful place of communion for me. And so I'm really glad that you went for one of those examples. And I just, I have this on the slide. I think it's important to mention that pleasure isn't the same as like the constructed bliss point that food science finds when they figure out how to make the chip, taste really good and light up all our senses and then disappear fast enough that your hand's back in the bag before you know it, right? So like pleasure has been commodified too, and we have to be able to be really like critical about which pleasures are the ones that we can sustain and that are really like, and which are the ones that are really us being manipulated by people who want to profit off of our desire for pleasure. So finding the space in there is important too. Okay, I know we need to wrap up. There are many more moves in the book. There's 2 more things I want to just draw your attention to before we close. And let me just pull them up because I think they're really, really useful. One of them is in the book itself, one is not. Okay, here we go. And here we go. Okay. Screen sharing is paused until I click back over. Okay. There we go. Okay. So I said at the very beginning, not an either or, right? And if you see this in the book, it's in 2 columns because that's how the publisher could convey it. I would love to like make a really beautiful graphic of this. But here are some of the characteristics of what looks more transactional and what looks more relational. And whenever I find myself uncomfortable with how I'm showing up in something, like I have a version of this slide on my desktop and I go back and I remind myself, like, am I, giving only when I can take something specific in return? Or am I giving or gifting without expecting that? Am I keeping receipts and tallying? And if so, why? Is it because someone is treating me really transactionally and I have to be ready to defend myself? Or am I doing that out of habit? And could I be offering more gratitude and trust here? How long is my long-term thinking? Is it less than one lifetime or is it extending across generations? And so there's lots of little prompts in this slide that I feel like are really helpful for making that shift towards moving toward relationship. And then finally, here are some of the things that I feel like I've learned over the last year and since the book was published. Certainly when I first encountered Janella Meadows' leverage points and that one that exists beyond paradigm shift, I don't think I understood it at all. Like, in fact, I think I kind of like used to gloss over it and be like, well, this one's really hard enough. So I don't know what to tell you about that one. But I think you have to really keep peering beyond your paradigm even after you make that shift, and continually feeding your mind and your spirit outside of food systems discourse, and then bring those lessons back in. It is rare now that I read the latest food systems book that comes out, because I'm too immersed in all of it. And like, even though the data might be updated, and even though some of the arguments might be really well articulated by the next person, it is more important for me at this point in my work, in my career, to be reading outside of food systems discourse and bringing that back in. And that the like value of that will vary for all of you based on where you are in your trajectory. But even if, like Ashley said before, she just finished her bachelor's degree, even if that's where you are, like, shake it up. Don't let your whole world become food systems spaces or discourse, because we start being in an echo chamber with each other. Refuse the timeline, refuse the climate timeline, refuse whatever timeline you think you're on. Don't make New Year's resolutions unless that speaks to you. Like, refuse. We're going to be long here. And by being long here, we might actually belong here. And that is really powerful. We won't all make it through the crises that are coming, but those of us who have tended our communities in ways that are able to carry forward wisdom and to nourish each other, like, are the hope and the possibility for the future. We can nourish those possibilities by changing the way we show up, and that's critically important. I think it is also worth saying that, oops, I moved the slide, that we need, can you still see it? No, doesn't like that. Okay. We need to humble ourselves, and that happens through peering beyond the paradigm. It happens through leading from a place of not always having the answers. It happens through ground truthing and changing the way we go about doing things as a result. And then really, really, really see where we can let go of comfort. Like, those of us zooming in here from places in the global north, I don't care how much money you're making. If you're here and you are currently housed and employed, you are among the globally most privileged people, like in the global top 10 to 20%, and maybe above that, depending on your individual circumstances. We have been raised in a space of so much comfort. And I think we have to be willing to be less comfortable in our material conditions and in our conversations and in the meetings we show up in, and try care and sometimes try provocation instead. And so I think those are some of the lessons that, like, I've been carrying into my work more recently. There are some good questions in here we'll skip over. If this kind of conversation is something you're craving more of, please join us in EcoGather. We have lots of learning resources, but more importantly, roughly each week, we do these on lunar cycles as part of refusing the timeline. We have these free, cozy online gatherings about a whole range of topics, some of which are directly food systems related, many more of which are about paradigm shifting. This last lunar cycle has been about resistance and disruption and opposition and violence, and having honest conversations about all of that. And next week we'll move into solidarity. The next cycle beyond that is, oh gosh, I should know what we're doing next. I don't. The one after that, which I'm leading, is all about weaving and social weaving. And so we take on lots of different topics, and they're a wonderful place to connect to more of this kind of conversation. But next week, Michelle will bring you into, or next month, Michelle will bring you into the story side of all of this. And I am certain that you can all be part of narrating our way into the worlds that our hearts know are possible. Thank you so much all for your time and attention, and your willingness to think about being more relational.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I'm gonna gather a bunch of links that were shared today, as well as things people shared in the chat, and follow up along with a registration link to the next webinar, we'll actually be taking narratives that we interact with in our everyday lives and thinking about how can we go about transforming those to suit, again, these values better and move towards relationship. But so great to receive your wisdom today, and thanks everyone for sticking with us. I know we're a little bit over time, but I think these things are worth grounding in.
Thanks so much, y'all. See you next month. We'll send an email with the registration info. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Elias.
Bye, everybody.